Nick's Senior Associate at Plus Architecture in Melbourne, and he focuses on the living and seniors living sector. He has a fantastic approach to how we can make projects stack up without necessarily costing any more money. In a world where feasibility is one of our largest challenges, he's got some great insights into this. Let's jump on in. Nick, thank you so much for joining us today on the Industry Leaders podcast. So, Nick, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and about Plus Studios, where you're from?
Of course. Thank you, Seton, for having me. I started at Plus Studio 13 years ago. I started as a student actually in 2009. And that was off the back of the GFC. So I had finished
Yeah.
my first degree at university. I didn't love university that much. I thought it was a bit, how to put it, pie in the sky. We never did a house, for instance. Um,
It's quite funny because as somebody who reviews a lot of folios and sees a lot of graduates coming up, yes, often you look at, especially, I know you went to Melbourne. Melbourne has a bit, Monash has a bit of this, a lot of very esoteric, theoretical type stuff. And then we always feel like we then have to teach somebody how to put a building together. So it sounds like you're always going to be that kind of practical architect. There's the theory of it and design, but obviously making sure how do we is that sort of where that sort of philosophies come from as well, you sort of found?
Yeah, exactly. I think at university, I kind of wasn't sure where I was going. We had the GFC and couldn't get a student position for a long time, actually,
Mm,
because no one had any work. So
yeah.
people were struggling to stay afloat. So luckily enough, Plus picked up a project that they were doing. They were redoing Taronga Village as it was getting built.
Yeah, right.
So they were changing the mix of that to suit the market, and they needed additional help with that, amongst other things. So I was lucky enough to get a student position there and loved it. I really loved working on complex real
Well,
world projects.
before we get ahead with that, I mean, I think that's something that a lot of people also, I think whilst economics goes up and down, then generally every 8 to 12 years, you will have a high and a low. Obviously, COVID kind of extended that out with the amount of infrastructure that was. So we're always due a downturn, and everybody's obviously worried about that at the moment. And we'll have a bit of a chat about that. We know Melbourne's going through a bit more of that. But I think it's always an important reminder because sometimes people come out when the market's really good and they don't see that until they're more into their career. And then it's probably understanding that, especially in architecture, it is actually quite, it's always seen as the canaries in the economy, that sometimes people don't get those opportunities. And that might be happening a bit at the moment, that there
Mm.
are quite a few people out there who are students or graduates and they're not finding those opportunities. What's sort of your tips for people like that, face that you're in that same situation, if they're doing the same type of stuff? Obviously, you're fortunate to find a great opportunity and you've proven yourself all the way through. But if you were to go back and give somebody a tip now, what would you say?
I would say don't get disheartened. It's not about you, it's about the profession and the
Mm,
industry in general. And try and find ways to work it out. Because as an architect, you're going to be a problem solver, and the best architects are often the best problem solvers. This is just one of those
mm,
problems I like to solve. So finding ways around barriers, whether it's growing your network, doing things differently in the way that you approach practices, I think is really can be interesting. And now we've got social media. We didn't have that then, so there are other ways to connect to people,
absolutely.
to broaden, I suppose, your presence and voice without
Mm.
having to go through those channels that we had to.
And I think that's great advice because one, I mean, it is a bit of a sometimes it can be a numbers game, right? But the other side is that it is giving you the skills. And I love the way that you've said that. It is about problem solving. If you put it into that psyche, in essence, the industry does go up and down, right? And as you've gone in your career as well, you are one day going to be in a position as a leader where you need to go and win work. And it's the same thing as well. You're going to need to learn to make connections. It's not going to be about you. It is about the market. It is then what you bring and how can you and your thoughts and the way you do that. And that's always going to make you more competitive. Um, But I think it's good, as you've said, that if you think about those innate skills, even if you're looking for a job, building those relationships is about building relationships and maintaining those relationships. Because I'm sure the relationships that you've built earlier on in your career now are starting to even emerge and prosper as those people become more in leadership positions themselves.
That's correct, Seton. Yeah, a lot of my own network, they're slowly evolving to become the decision makers in their relevant companies. So yeah, it's an
Yeah.
exciting time for me, for my network too.
Anyway, so continue on. Sorry to interrupt your story there. It was a good segue. I don't want to come back to that. So you obviously started as a student in the GFC, in a downturn, hard to get a job, got a fantastic opportunity. And where did it go from there?
Yeah, it was great. I loved it. I picked up skills, was really excited about university again. Um, and after a while, I came back to Plus. I did do some work at a smaller residential firm doing more high end projects.
Yeah.
That was really interesting as well. That gave me a bit of a foundation in, money is no object, and it was more about the atmosphere, more about the narrative, more about the unfolding journey through a house
Yeah.
or a project, and it was really great for me to be able to get that kind of different perspective on things as well.
Yeah.
But
Absolutely.
ultimately, yeah, I did want to come back and do more complex projects because I really enjoyed that at Plus. The bigger, more complex side of architecture really had me in a chokehold at that point. So that was
Look, we assume most people do know about Plus and what you do, but do you want to tell us a little bit about what Plus specialises in, particularly in the Melbourne market where you're from as well?
yeah. So Plus specializes, I suppose, in accommodation. We help developers, property developers, unlock sites in terms of the urban, um, what am I saying? Yeah, sorry.
Landscape, maybe?
In terms of like the urban potential as well as the economic potential, I would say.
Yeah.
And at the end of the
Um,
day, it's about creating quality homes for people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we were talking about that a little bit before around some of the things that you personally have found what your point of difference is and how you go about things. So, I mean, you've worked within, as you said, um, the residential multi-res type of space, a living sector, if we want to put it into the broader spectrum, including seniors living as well, with some things that you were working in earlier on in your career. And as you said, you've played both a role within the business development side of things, but also then the design and winning work through good design and approaching that. So tell us a little bit about your approach to design and how you help developers to solve the current problems that they have.
Well, personally, I like to make sure you're asking the right questions. I think a lot of the time when we partner up with a developer, we can often be seen as someone that we're dictated to, but I think the best results can often be when we are working together, understanding where they're coming from and working from first principles to get the best result. So we can get the right answer to a lot of things, but if we're not asking the right questions, then we're probably going to get not the right answer and not add the value that we
Yeah.
can.
And I think at the moment, as we spoke about, there are challenges, and we'll kind of talk a little bit about those. So, obviously, the biggest challenge most people are facing at the moment is construction costs. And then maybe in the Melbourne market, obviously, the housing prices have decreased in comparison to, I am from Melbourne. I have a house in Melbourne still, and I live in Queensland, and it's definitely missed the boat up here, shall we say, but definitely didn't miss the boat in Melbourne. So we understand that it is hard for people to be able to get things to stack up. What are the challenges that you're seeing within the market overall at present?
Look, I think people want to do good things, but nothing happens if it doesn't make economic sense. And at the moment here, it's in the last few years, it's been difficult for projects to do so.
Mm,
So what we're seeing a lot of is people trying to work through the problems that we have here in the construction costs. what I think we do have here is an opportunity in Melbourne where we can kind of have a reset and a rethink about what we want to do as a city and what we want to see. Because at the moment, we're kind of just pulling the lever of yield, of scale to try and solve this problem. But what if we don't have to do that? What if there are other things that we could do potentially through either, incentives for really good outcomes that we want to see in the public realm? So I myself am on the UDIA infill committee,
Mm.
and am trying to advocate for other ways that we can potentially get the great results and great outcomes and great buildings that we want to see in Melbourne, and that
Yeah.
we want to live in.
And what are some of the things that you're sort of approaching in that way? You know, I think you talked a bit about atmosphere, and I'm going to get the incorrect. You had another term that you were using before as well.
Oh, personally, what I like to do in a lot of the architecture that I do, and this is sort of on the side of the feasibility and project costs, um, is try and do more with less. So using I suppose, the elements of building blocks that we have and push them to the nth degree, making sure that we're using those elements rather than covering them up, and try and work with what we have better than throwing stuff on top of it. So, if we've got precast columns that, have junctions with other things, let's not cover it up with plasterboard. Let's celebrate that a little bit. Let's use those elements and make
Yeah.
them beautiful. I really enjoy working with the existing structure of things, and making that sing. I really love that. And it's not necessarily the thing that we get to do a lot of, but it's the thing that we try and do as much as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's it really, because as you started off with, design is a problem solving, right? And the same way engineers are. Essentially, design can make a big difference. Yes, there may be markets, and you're talking about yields and things like that that we need to add up. In the living space, there'll be different parts of that, whether it's build to rent or it's actually, new builds and development sell. People will put a value on something though where the design is higher, which is obviously why they come to people like yourself who are experts in this field to really put into that premium product range. But as you're saying, though, you can still create that atmosphere or this way of creating great design without adding in additional costs. And it sounds like that's really what you're taking quite a look at, is how do we create great design outcomes without necessarily maybe we able to strip it back within the budget, because we might be not be adding more materials right now or adding more labor in to be able to build those materials. And that's fundamental for architects. As you mentioned, it is about the economics. And I think maybe that's what you found at university. Often I see people come out and they're looking at, oh wow, and I can create this beautiful thing, as you said, or if a budget is no option. But at the end of the day, every client does have a budget. And particularly now with interest rates and things like that, those economics have to add up. And so being able to use design to increase the value of the property, but also decrease the costs of it is, I think, quite fundamental in what we're going to see for the next, we are in a downturn and we're in very uncertain times, but not economically right now. We're recording this, in the end of March into April. So, I think the next few months are going to be quite interesting how they play out. And is that sort of what you're finding developers are really finding with yourself and with Plus as one of the added bonuses that you can add?
Yeah, for sure. I think in terms of what you just said, form follows finance, whether we like it or not, and we work within that realm. For instance, we're doing this really great adaptive reuse of an office building, the old RMIT building, on Bourke Street, where we're turning that into almost 900 student accommodation beds. And we managed to create a floor plan that sort of used these kind of Tetris-like blocks to use the facade that was already existing, and we're going to sort of insert the student
Wow.
beds within that framework rather than having to add on top of that. So that streamlined the process. We got the number of dwellings that we needed to within the existing structure by being creative and using a bit of a Tetris like floor plan. And that streamlined the process. We got it through planning really quickly. And I think it's really great for Bourke Street, because Bourke Street before, I think it's had a bit of a revitalisation with Mecca, adding,
Mm,
adding a bit of interest on the floor plan. But it's really hasn't had the life that we need it to have, I think, as a
yeah.
mall in the city. So I think, adding 900 students in there is going to be really great for the city. And that's what we want to do more of.
Wow. Yeah, well, I think that's a great segue into we've talked a bit about the challenges, and I'm happy for mention any others that you see. But what do you see as the opportunities now? And I think that's the thing. When money gets tight, people can either give up or they think about things in a smarter way of being able to solve problems that they didn't think when money may have been a bit more plentiful. Is that one of the things that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think people are trying to sort of circumvent the planning process in certain ways. We are finding that people are just trying to find extra scale through that um, pathway, and it's not necessarily making things quicker as expected. So what
Mm,
what we're seeing is that people are trying to do things in different ways, but I do think that we do need to have a think about what we want to see as a city in Melbourne, and whether we can have a bit of a reset in terms of how we approach development and how we can get the type of development that we want to see, where the
mm.
scale that people want to live in. Because at the moment, we're just pulling the lever of scale. And how can we potentially reduce costs, reduce time, and do things differently to not necessarily get the scale greater, but reduce the cost to get better results in the urban realm?
Well, and I think that's the thing. I mean, Melbourne is a city that people go to because of the culture. I've grown up and lived in Melbourne my entire life, right? And then the weather was too cold, and so I was always going to move here with kids. Um, but I think it's one of those cities that it always has been. It's not, it doesn't the Yarra as much as I love it and as a row of, know every inch of it. It's not necessarily, I suppose, the attraction that you will get in other cities like Perth or Melbourne, or you don't have the harbour that you get in Sydney and things like that. And so it is actually how we've architecturally built it. And, you think about everything that's existed. I pretty much lived all my young life in the city or around the city, like that heartbeat. And I felt after COVID, we actually lost a lot of that because so many small businesses went out of, because it always was. It's essentially designed a big circle really around the bay where everybody kind of comes into the city. And now there is different. I mean, it's good in one way because now it means there's different, more suburban sort of business centers and things like that opening up, or more centers where people are coming and to live and to work and to integrate. But I think that is one of the opportunities you're saying. We've still got to keep going from the standard of architecture and design that we've always expected in Melbourne and why people come, because it feels like a European city. It doesn't mean Europeans better, but it feels like a city that's got culture and it comes and people don't want bad architecture. That's going to last for the next 50 to 70, 100 years, depending on what we're doing. And that's where I don't think Melbourne can lose its identity as a cultural city by sacrificing design. But when it is tight, being smarter about how we go about that. And is that one of the things that you see as an opportunity?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that I think we can bring the most value in is making sure that we're asking the right questions along that journey. So making sure that, instead of knocking down a building completely, are there ways that we can reuse that to make sure that, we aren't losing that cultural essence or identity.
Mm,
And sometimes it's just really interesting when it's not even a heritage building that we have to keep, but something that's got an existing, grunginess or
yeah.
texture, um,
Mm,
and those type of elements are really cool. It's often where there's new meets old, or there's a tension between one thing and another thing. That's where the real magic happens. So when you get a city that's really new, everything's really new, it kind of feels a bit bland. It doesn't have that context, that cultural essence that we have in Melbourne. So I totally agree with you on that one.
and look, I think that is one of the special things about Melbourne. Right, and I must say, the planning is much better too, simple things of making sure you got footpaths and stuff like that, and it's funny coming from Melbourne and then moving to other cities, and you kind of go, "Oh, what do you mean? Where is this design?" You can go into any suburb, like, I lived around Richmond, Abbotsford, and, you talk about that change. I was there when that was all happening, taking the old factories and putting them into new developments, and all of that was literally going around me for about 20 years. But I think it's really it's funny because coming to another city where there isn't quite the same ethos and it is changing and it is evolving, you can actually see the difference. And if we can't drop our design standards, in essence, we just have to be smarter about how we do it because we will lose, I think, the essence of what is. And, that is either that's something that attracts people or puts people off very quickly. And we can't be thinking in just short term. And I think that's the hard thing when working with developers, unless you're doing build to rent, obviously it is about the turnover of the asset, but as the designers, making sure how to get the best outcome for the developers, but make sure you're also getting the best outcome from everybody who's going to enjoy that now, in 20 years, in the future,
Yeah.
and be accessing these environments and communities.
I think you brought up a really interesting point where in Melbourne, it's a lot of those kind of in between spaces, in between buildings and, that streetscape that make it interesting. And that's kind of something that we do like to imbue, especially in the more community-led projects where we do have those kind of third spaces or those common areas that are kind of got a bit more thought to it, got a bit more
Mm,
generosity to it. And those are the places where you got to build them. So can we get the best out of those to make them those kind of increase the bump factor, I like to call it, especially in senior living or, these type of projects where people can kind of get, a bit um, in too much in their own realm. So trying to create connections in these other
yeah.
third spaces is something that we really try and do very well.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, and I'm completely it's you're living a lot more indoors or in built environments in Melbourne than you are living, I now live in Queensland, in larger spaces, and so it is really, really important. I remember that. Often you could not talk to your neighbour, right? Whereas here, everybody is, quite happy to have a good chat. And I think that is one of those elements where it is actually when you start to create communities. And I must say, having, pretty much lived most of my 20s and 30s in Richmond,
Mhm.
that was a community, but it was built, sometimes you wouldn't always talk to your neighbour, depending what your neighbour was like, because you're very on top of each other sometimes. But at the same time, you would know everybody, you would be seeing everybody around all of the time because it is quite dense living. And so it is nice because community is what is important to us. It's what we want as human beings. That's what we want to feel. And I know we now live in a world where it's, stated that we've got the highest rate of loneliness around. So those interactions are actually very, very important, particularly in a digital world where we're looking at looking at phones most of the time instead of talking to each other. So I think
Yeah.
that bump factor you talk about is exceptionally important. Let's talk a bit about the future and where you see things going. So obviously, AI is emergence right now. I think, with all the volatility going on internationally at present, it affects different people in different ways. But what do you see as, I suppose, where you see the future for architecture and the design industry and the built industry for the next 10 to 20 years?
I definitely think that AI is part of the answer, especially in becoming more efficient in what we deliver. I don't necessarily think that it's going to, take over our roles at all because I strongly believe that if you asked 10 architects to design a building for you, you would get 10 different designs and AI would just have an 11th one. But making sure that we are, again, asking the right questions and allowing AI to do the rest for us in a way will become more and more
Mm,
important. But if we're asking AI the wrong questions, it's just going to, bullshit in, bullshit out in a way. So,
well, exactly. Yeah, we know that too. Yeah. So, and I think Look, I mean, we spoke to somebody else who said there's two things. Some people think things are AI and things are automation, right? AI is artificial intelligence, the ability to generally either do a task that is or to play out. So, and it's not like we haven't seen this done for years. So, we've seen this obviously being programmed with Dynamo scripts and things like Revit for many years to be able to, computational design is actually the label we should be putting on it, be able to look at multiple different ways of, inversions and reiterations. But as you said, if you don't have the right data to put in, or if you don't have somebody who's looking at that, and I look at it as another tool, really, at the end of the day, AI is fundamentally changing the way that we work and will continue to fundamentally change. I think one of my biggest concerns is how is this looking? I mean, you've had 13 years of experience now, right? How do you think it would be you learning your tools of this is a software tool, bit like Revit, bit like, photoshopping and Enscaping it up. But how do we make sure that people still learn the fundamentals of how a building goes together and the parts that they need to know so what comes out, they know if it's wrong or if it's right?
Yeah, it's tricky. And I think that's one of the things that through COVID we lost is the ability to go on site and understand how buildings go together. And a lot of our sort of, younger colleagues are
Mhm.
poor because of that. But yeah, just getting the exposure is really important for younger people. Having a look, getting work experience where you can, because the more that you understand. And I was lucky in a way because when I came back to Plus as a graduate, I firstly delivered three projects. So working in the back end of those, I was doing townhouses and then 230-story apartment towers. So
Yeah, right.
I had the design interest first, but then I learned how things got put together. So then when I got back into the design realm of things, I really understood that. And I don't think a lot of, the younger people get exposed to that these days, which is
Mm. And we often talk about that you can be a theoretical designer, but it's actually the ability to know, is this going to stack up? Is this actually going to work? How are we actually going to build it? And that's what a real designer is, somebody who actually understands, can push the limits, right? And understand what needs to be delivered, but also actually knows this is going to be built versus that's not possible. And that's going to
yeah.
bust the budget. I think it's fundamental.
And a lot of, I encourage my team and my stars in my team to go spread their wings and work in the back end, work in the documentation and delivery side of things. Because when they come back
Mm.
to me, I know that they're going to be better off for it.
Yeah, and I think that's well, absolutely, and I think that's the advantage. Obviously, working in a big organization, you're gonna get exposure to really big projects you're not necessarily gonna get exposure to in smaller firms. But I'm sure in that time that you're working for a smaller firm, working on residential, you do get to turn projects around a lot quicker. Depends on the size and the scale. It sounds like you're working on some pretty mega ones. But in general, within 12 months or 24 months, you should get to work on quite a few projects end to end. I think that is the advantage of, coming with small firms. I often look at candidates who work at small firms and I actually go, we often find that they're a lot stronger because they've already had it and seen the entire cycle. They just need the size and the scale. And the next, is that what you find as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's something that we find a lot of, and you can really find some, I suppose, diamonds in the rough, so to speak.
Mm.
People that do have the skill set, capable to go in more complex projects, but for whatever reason, maybe they felt more comfortable there. They didn't choose the more complex path, but that's okay. And everyone's on their own journey, and if they want to come and try something else and see if they like it, feel
Absolutely, absolutely, and I mean, Plants has got a fantastic reputation. It's gonna put your folio and you'll look absolutely fantastic on it and learn from great people like yourself. But as we talked about, not everybody can always get large firms into large firms to start with. Majority of the market is obviously small firms. So if you are looking at an opportunity, with a smaller firm, there is advantages to both, right? And I think, that's a good thing. If you can't find an opportunity in a larger firm, go and also look for opportunities in smaller firms where you might not be as sexy a projects, but you're certainly going to learn a lot. And then, people like Plus will be very happy for you to come along later as well.
Yeah, I think it's great. Like when I was at a smaller practice, it was working hands on with a director. We're working things out together. I was learning a lot about how they thought about things and how they
Mm,
manage clients and how they manage a business. So it was really a great experience. And you take the most important thing is that you take from these experiences, you learn from these experiences. So I think it's, yeah, a really great thing to work in that realm.
yeah, absolutely. And finishing on that, then what are some skills that you believe are fundamental to people continuing to develop that won't change in the next 10 to 20 years?
Definitely critical thinking. I've harped on it a few times, but like there's this quote that I love from this poet, E. E. Cummings, and it's always a beautiful answer who asks a more beautiful question. And
I
it's
like it.
really about, yeah, making sure that we're asking the right questions. Because if we're not asking the right questions, we're never going to get the right answer.
Yeah,
So critical thinking
absolutely.
is all to that.
And as you mentioned as well, obviously working with people and understanding the nature of working with understanding different personality types and different working styles. But I'm assuming also in what you were doing with business development and starting out as well, the people factor is not going to go away.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Working with different people, aligning yourself with different people, like it's something that you have to do if you want to progress in your career. It's understanding different types of personalities and not necessarily changing yourself to suit them, but
Mhm.
is there commonalities? Is there things that we can do to get the best results? And making sure that, you're approaching things in a way that they can comprehend. It's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Now, Nick, we always ask people to make a recommendation about a book or a podcast or somewhere that they find inspiration from. Is there anything that you want to share with the audience today?
I really enjoy Stephen Hole's books. He's an architect that um, uses color and light, and the books have got lots of pictures. If you don't like to read, but yeah, I really enjoy Stephen Hole's work, and the books are beautiful as well.
Great. All right. Well, we'll get you to send us some of those details, include them in the show notes as well. Nick, thank you so much for all your time and your insights into things. And we look forward to talking to you further later.
Thank you, Sid. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. It was great to talk to Nick. He had some great insights into different approaches we can do it. And I really liked his story about where he started as a student, particularly in the GFC. I think it's a great point of view for people who may be struggling right now when the markets are a bit tight in some regions. It is one of those things you need to think out of the box. And I like that approach of we are problem solvers. And that is literally what we are paying for designers to do and for people to be involved. At the end of the day, if you approach any problems you've got in finding a role as a problem solver in the same way you would for a client in coming out with a great outcome, this is setting you up for success, for skills for the future.